Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us in this panel today, both online and in person. We're here today to talk about the urgency and the opportunity to build a more resilient society. And we have an excellent panel here with us today. So you may have heard in some of the earlier sessions today about the transition. And sometimes we talk about the inevitable journey to a low emission future. It is now looking like that's the direction of travel, but it's the speed at which we reach there that is in question now. But there's also another transition that is equally critical and equally important, and that is the transition to resilience. And the transition to resilience isn't as inevitable as sort of the journey that we're seeing in the transition to net zero. But there's a lot of uncertainty around the transition to resilience. The policy signals are unclear, the financial flows are thin, and it's really a question of how fast can we get there now? Will we be able to bolster our defenses and to be prepared? Will we be able to deal with the next big disaster that's coming our way? Or are we going to see more devastation at unimaginable scales? I'm from Pakistan, and it was a harrowing sort of year for us. There's 23 million people affected by floods in my country. I now live in Canada, where 18 million hectares of land were completely engulfed in flames, and those fires are still going. They're going to go throughout the year. So there's really no escape from the impacts of climate change. The impacts are here. I think everyone in some way or the other is experiencing those impacts. So, no doubt about where we're at in terms of the risks. But we are at a pivotal moment now where these challenges really are colliding with the potential for transformative change. And we have a choice to make here. Are we going to prepare ourselves? Are we going to get on a pathway towards a transition to a more resilient future? We talk a lot about risks and understanding risks, and I feel like there's still more we can do to understand our risks, but we really need to move our attention now from understanding the risks to really looking at what are the meaningful actions to address that risk and those risks. I think there's a real need to shift the narrative. There's a lot of fear and uncertainty around what are we going to do? How are we going to prepare? But we really need to trade in this sort of fear, this uncertainty for something else, for something better. We need to think about how we have to believe in our capacity to reimagine our economies, our societies, and our financial systems. So I'm really hoping that today we can talk a little bit more about this. I think this session is, of course, about climate resilience, but it's not just about climate resilience. It really is an open invitation to you all, please, as well as the panelists, to see resilience as a path to not just a resilient future, but a prosperous future, a more equitable future. So with that, I will turn over to our exceptional panelists, all close allies and partners of Climate Bonds, and I will do a quick introduction. So we have with us Paola Arbrito. She is the director of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. UNDRR not only coordinates global efforts to address disaster risk, but also serves as a hub for sharing knowledge, expertise, and best practices, facilitating international cooperation to build a safer and more resilient future for communities across the globe. She has extensive experience in supporting disaster resilience and sustainable development policies and instruments in Africa, Europe, and Central Asia. And we're very excited to hear more from Paula today. Our next speaker is Bertrand Milo. Sorry, I've skipped order a little bit. He's the head of sustainability at CDPQ, which is one of the largest institutional investors in Canada and one of the largest pension fund managers globally, with assets under management exceeding 400 billion. Bertrand leads the sustainability team, which is responsible for defining and implementing CDPQ's strategic directions, including integrating ESG factors into all of their activities. And then we have, oh, sorry, my notes. Let me get that sorted. Sorry about that. Sophie. Sophie Evans is the Associate Director of Advisory at the Center for Disaster Protection, an organization that focuses on disaster risk financing to help ensure that money and plans are in place before disaster strikes, so that the poorest and most vulnerable people are better protected. Sophie is a specialist in risk, climate, and innovative financing, having led strategic global projects from within the private sector for partners, including governments, multilaterals, and international corporates. So with that, I'd really love to kick us off. I'd like to start off the conversation with a question for you, Paola, if I may. Given UNDRR's role in addressing disaster risk, can you set the stage for us today with your insights on what is the urgency for investments? Why do we need those investments in climate resilience now? And can you tell us a bit if you've seen any trends of a shifting narrative on the urgency for directing investments towards resilience?
Thank you very much for your question. And in fact, I feel like you already touched upon a number of issues while you were introducing our session. First of all, yes, there is a very urgent need of investing in disaster risk reduction and in resilience. To many of you, it will make sense. This is something that you read in the news every day, whether it is flood in Libya, whether it is Morocco earthquake, whether it is the fires that you referred to in Canada, in Greece, Hawaii, and of course, the drought in the Horn of Africa. And I know that we are starting with a negative and concerning note, but this is not something that is going to be going away. In 2020, UNDRR has published a global assessment report. And what we indicated there is that while in 2020, we had, in 2015, we had overall 400 disasters per year. The projections are telling us that by 2030, we're going to be moving to 560. It's a 40% increase, which means basically 1.5 disaster per year. What we can see is that we are somehow trapped in a circle that really talks about disaster, response, recovery, and then the repeat of the disaster. And this is something that we need to cancel. We need to be able to break it. And in order to be able to do so, we need to invest, and we need to invest more towards resilience. So the role for you is big, is important, and needs to be timely. There is a good news in these elements of concern that I think we need to keep with us, and we need to make the most of it. Is the fact that investing in resilience does bring some important returns. If you're thinking about resilient infrastructure, $1 invested, 4 return. So it makes sense also in terms of overall economic terms. And I think this is important because, as you were mentioning, we really need to build a narrative that is conducive and that is positive. And what we're saying is that if the situation is concerning and it's going to be getting worse because of climate change, we have a narrative that can be positive. We just need to work towards it together, and we need to activate ourselves as fast as possible.
Absolutely. And just picking up on that last point, I think that is sort of like the good news, that there is, the narrative is shifting. I'd really like to pick up on that point and hand over to you, Bertrand, to hear a bit more about what your perspective is as an investor. Do you see opportunity for returns and investment in resilience? What is your take on the role of private capital in this, in terms of building resilience?
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me here. Hi, everybody. Resilience is very, very important, and I would say at the very least, it's investing in resilience is a way not to incur costs or reduction of value at the very least. And in certain cases, it is an opportunity. So definitely something that is on our radar. I think investing in resilience projects, that would be where the opportunity is. Unfortunately, and we might touch on that later, those are few and far between. But certainly for portfolio companies, it is a very important subject. And we take this very, very seriously at CDPQ. We have about $60 billion in infrastructure investments across the globe and $50 billion in real estate. And this is mostly internally managed, things we own and we have large positions in. And so to us, the questions of resilience is key. And we have tools to appraise this issue, to raise flags. And increasingly, it's not just for us because we are a shareholder, we don't run these companies, but is to raise the issue with the CEOs of our companies so that they actually do something about it. And that dialogue needs to increase, the right questions need to be asked. And also an important aspect is you need to look, and this is a strange concept in finance, beyond the asset you're financing. I'll take an example, a silly example, but imagine you have a manufacturing plant on top of the hill. Is there a risk of flooding? Probably not, except if there is a bridge at the bottom of the hill and the bridge is washed away. And then you're out of business for 6 months. So you need to look at resilience that way. I can tell you we have a port in a country, and we know that there is an issue with rising seas, obviously. But even if we do something about the quay walls, the rail and road infrastructure that leads to the port will be underwater. And so we need to speak to the local government. And what are the plans? What are the plans for the city? And so that's the way you need to look at it much more broadly than just looking at your asset thinking, well, I'm going to make a return on this one. Maybe not. It's like a supply chain issue.
Absolutely. Those are, I think, really important points, the sort of systemic, holistic nature of risks and also cascading risks. You know, you have climate risks, but you also have other types of risks and they're all interacting. So we really have to look at it holistically. So, yeah. Sophie, I'd like to turn over to you a bit. Your work leans heavily on financing for disaster preparedness. So really curious to hear more about what you think the role resilience finance has to play in supporting more sort of pre-agreed financing. So not financing the recovery, but financing, before a disaster strikes.
Thank you. That's a fantastic example. I was actually going to use something similar. So what we do at the Center for Disaster Protection is really work in low and middle income countries. And we're part of the aid architecture, so financed by international donors as part of their aid portfolio, and go and support our clients who are low income governments. They are also international NGOs and DFI, so development banks, who are working with low and middle income countries to ensure that money is in place to finance a response before the disaster happens, because we know that there are not quick money is much more effective to respond to the flood, the drought, the earthquake, the tsunami, the pandemic, than money that is found after the event. And part of that is also having really strong and robust contingency plans. So the person whose job it is to manage the risk and finance the risk knows what they can rely on to ensure there's predictable response. That might feel quite far away from the transition conversation we've been having today. And an example I wanted just to pull out from the previous panel actually is, if you are working really, really hard as a national government to decarbonize all of your infrastructure, your schools, your hospitals, your community centers, there's a money for that. There's a budget line for that. What there probably isn't is a budget line for the roof that's going to fall off because of the hurricane whilst you're busy transitioning your buildings as well. And so for us, disastrous financing is part of the toolkit that we are going to need to support low income economies and middle income economies and high income economies, to be able to respond to growing risk around the world, whilst also implementing the finance for this path of transition. Part of what we focus on is this pre-agreed financing, and we have a report coming out at the end of the month. And I stand here in front of my colleagues who've actually written it, where when we look at the international crisis financing, that's the portfolio of the aid money around the world. So the floods in Pakistan, largely financed by the international crisis financing architecture, public finance that moves around the world. Only 2.7% of that, several billions of dollars that you all pay for as taxpayers, was pre-agreed. So the government of Pakistan did not have pre-agreed financing in place. It did have a little bit, and it had to urgently jump on the phone as a Minister of Finance and the response agency to try and find the money to protect the lives and the livelihoods of the people affected by those floods. And we know that money comes in late. And we know, I think Sean mentioned it earlier, the other Sean, that actually the best way to conceive of that is business interruption. And that's business interruption for you as portfolio managers and investors. It's also lives and livelihoods for us who work in the aid sector. So whilst the transition conversation is quite far away from what I do, it's so linked. To Bertrand's point, you cannot think of these things in isolation. You have to be ready for the next shock whilst you're also transitioning for a low carbon future. And part of what we do is help governments understand how to put those budget lines together, how to create really robust resilience plans whilst also striving for a transition agenda as well. So I'll probably stop there, but just to explain a little bit about how disastrous financing we believe aligns with the preparedness agenda, risk reduction agenda, but also the transition agenda too.
Thank you for raising that point, because I think it's so critical that we bring these conversations together on transition to a net zero and transition to resilience, because you can't really achieve the objectives of transitioning to a zero carbon future if you're busy, recovering from disastrous floods and heat waves. So these two conversations have to be interlinked. So thank you very much for raising that. I'd like to pose a more general question to all three of you, if I may. What is the single biggest trigger for scaling up resilience investments in your view? And if I could start with you, Paula, that'd be great.
More than triggers, I think we need to bridge some gaps that I can see, at least from the side of the governments, for instance. As UN, we work a lot with governments in order for them to become more resilient. And what we see in terms of investments is that we really need to try to help them to best understand which one are the activities that can be supported through issuing of bonds, for instance, and how does this happen? So basically, how countries can work in order to develop a sort of pipeline of resilience measures that can be used. And this is an important gap because it does not allow for the government itself to be able to move forward in order to think on how to best receive investors and having possibility of opening up these sort of opportunities. From UNDRR side, we can help. We can help in order to identify which one can be these activities. And we already touched upon actually on some examples, for instance, in terms of resilience infrastructure, or what does it mean, the support to implement an overall plan that addresses disaster risk reduction, the establishment of early warning systems. So all these elements are going to be helping in triggering clarity in which one are the activities that needs to be put forward. And of course, on the other side, we also have the investors that equally needs to be very clear on where they're going to be investing, which one are the standards that are necessary for their investments, because at the end of the day, they want to know that whatever investments they're going to be made is reflecting their considerations in terms of resilience. And there again, we can see that there is a gap. So I feel like there are a lot of opportunities, but we need to do a little bit of extra work together, hand in hand. And here, let me put a point that it's a fundamental point. When we're talking about resilience and disaster risk reduction, we're talking by nature about different stakeholders, different communities. Bringing the communities together is a fundamental step for UNDRR. And bringing the investors community, the private sectors with us, it's a must, but it's also a learning experience from each other. And what I can see from the classic disaster risk reduction community, being the Minister of Interior, the Minister of Security, they have very few, let's say, tools and understanding in hands in order to have a constructive discussion with the Minister of Finance and in order to trigger, of course, the call for further investments.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paula. I think that makes the barriers you've identified and the opportunities to address those barriers are like so spot on. So thank you for sharing that. Who would like to go next on the triggering investment question?
Yes, it's a very interesting thing. I think finance need to think at it differently and forget the finance lessons. The finance lessons will tell you that if an event happens, so there's a probability of occurrence, call it 20%, the damage it will do to your asset, maybe 10%, 20% times 10% is 2%. And by the way, time value of money, because it's not going to happen tomorrow. So maybe in 2019 or in 2029 or whenever. So you discount it to the present and you get very comfortable that it's irrelevant. The value is zero or so close to zero that who cares? Wrong. Because it could happen tomorrow. It could happen tomorrow. And it could be much more damaging than your nice calculations have determined. And so one needs to think that way. There is a question in my mind, and we're not there yet, but finance collectively need to think how to better reflect that value in the valuations of assets, but the risk there is clear and present. And it needs to be better reflected. Zero is not the right answer. That's for sure. And if we start thinking that way, then suddenly the issue becomes, oh, yeah, we need to deal with it. And invest in resilience. We can invest through governments or government projects, but a lot of it will come down to industrial companies, to state-owned companies, to metro companies, to whatever, that need to, each and every one of these companies need to actually do something to strengthen their resilience against climate change. That's very important. The other aspect is chronic risk, which finance underestimates greatly: heat. I'll give you a sad example. Last June in Kansas, not in some hot desert emerging market, in Kansas, 2,000 cows died from one day to the next because of heat. It had been very hot for the first few days, and the nights were also very hot, and the cows just died. 2,000 cows dead from 1 minute to the next. That applies to humans as well, much more tragically, but also it applies to construction sites. Do you think you're building, we're an investor in infrastructure or in real estate, and we think, okay, well, it's going to take 2 years to build that building, except that for 6 months, because the summer is particularly hot, etc., we can't build because the construction site is at a standstill because it's too hot. That's not science fiction, it's happening today. And so finance need to think about these things very, very clearly and really realize the impact. And the problem is it's unpredictable. Maybe next summer won't be too hot. And the following one, it won't be 2 months of superheat, it will be 3. And so finance can't deal with that kind of uncertainty, but we need to learn how to.
Absolutely. I think the extreme heat sort of impacts are so inevitable, and they're already here, along with all the other impacts that we're seeing. So yeah, we have to really move urgently on getting finance to flow. So I'd really like to turn to the audience for a few minutes, if I may, because I'd really want to hear, what are people seeing as really big opportunities for shifting the needle on resilience finance? What are you sort of, in this, there's seeing in terms of initiatives, trends in the market, and big opportunities? So let's get a little bit interactive and have more of a discussion with people who are here. If I may start. Yeah, sure, Sean. Thank you.
Sorry, you've probably heard enough from me. I'm a plant. Just want to say a couple of things about the panel there. Sophie has been working with the centre, I know, for 5 or 6 years at least now. That was a brainchild out of the IDF originally. And of course, our relationship with the UNDRR over the last however many, 8, 9 years is also because we met through this wonderful public-private partnership, which is the development. But we all created our own little bilaterals, and we've all gone off and done some great things. And the one I just want to bring up, and all credits to the UNDRR and primarily to Mami Misatori, who's the head there, is that we put a report out in 2021 about protecting lives and livelihoods, and identified the ways in which insurance can measure resilience in its business. So it's called the 7 mechanisms. The report is also available. It's on your wonderful prevention web you have at the UNDRR. It's a great resource out if you ever want to go there. But this was a joint collaboration with both of us. We threw a load of case studies, about 60 case studies in of what insurers were doing around the world in all countries in terms of resilience. And then we came up with these 7 mechanisms. So this is what you can do. And it's a real action point and an initiative that came out of the 2 organizations. So number 1 is we can use our pricing to drive better citizenship towards sustainability. Number 2 is we can drive pre-existing exemptions and make sure that things we're going to insure, like building codes and stuff like that, are actually built into the insurance policy. Number 3, we can focus on investment and invest in resilient infrastructure, resilient projects with a proper outcome that is measured according to the 7 mechanisms and the SDGs now. Number 4 is about the education and the awareness that we can create in the communities we serve, because those that are educated about what they can do to make their own communities more resilient is far more positive and far more actionable than, say, a government trying to say you should do this. That's just the way it is. People listen to people in their own communities. So there are lots of great examples around that. Number 5 is anyone that's doing risk modeling and then sharing it with the whole of their community or their country or their society. And there's some great examples there. They may have built a model for floodplains, or there's a great one in Holland where they've done that. A company called Achmea have built a floodplain model, which they thought they were going to use, but then they found that no one was using it. But as soon as they gave it to the people of the Netherlands, they're all using it now when they buy a house to find out where they sit in a floodplain. So, and you know, you do loads of great stuff on that. So Sophie, that is. So that's a great example of how we can share things more. Number 6 is around the social impact that you actually have. And Japan's a great example of where you can get a lot of social good that happens through insurance companies. There is a link to the education piece there as well, but the social good. And number 7 is about public-private partnerships. And it comes back to, we can't do this by ourselves. We're all in this together. So they're the 7 mechanisms. Out of that, last year, using our members and UNDRR's knowledge, we have developed a metrics to measure the success of how you're doing it. And we've just started to put out some of our earlier ones. The scores are out of 50. It's not difficult to do. And it really is a case of a couple of hours. We'll get it done for your company. It doesn't matter how big you are. It's about driving peer-to-peer challenge and case studies to make our world a safer, more resilient place. So that's what it's there for. We've had so much interest in the ICMIF UNDRR resiliency benchmark that the GRI now wants to use it. I think I said that earlier. We've also got the IDF is using it in some of their projects that Sophie talked about. They're trying to embed it into some of these country projects. We haven't found a way yet, but we will, because it is the only measurement metrics that's out there. So there's multiple uses for it. It might not be in the current format we have, which is targeted at insurers, but when we start to talk about country initiatives and projects, I think that's great. So you know, hats off to you guys. All of the public-private partnerships that are working are really starting to show real action on the ground. I'll leave it at that. It's not a question you asked me to make. Sorry.
No, thank you so much. I think just showing the menu of options that we have and the different types of interventions we can make it's inspiring to hear, because we need lots of different tactics and strategies to address this incredibly complex challenge. And I think the data element also is just so critical, to have more open source data, to be able to provide risk information to countries so that they can act. And we have the information, it needs to really reach more people. So yeah, thank you for your comments. Would anyone, sorry, did
No,
anyone
there's a
on
couple
the,
of questions as well, as if we want to take questions. I didn't know what you.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we can do that. Do you want to respond at all to anything said so far, or should we go to the audience?
I'll just add something very important, building codes, which the gentleman mentioned there. We realized, this is in Canada, I don't know how it is elsewhere in the world, the fact that the building codes were actually designed a long time ago. And the way engineers think about building codes is to take climate data from the past, take the extremes out so that they don't overbuild. And there you go. Exactly what not to do. And therefore, don't comfort yourself that, oh yeah, it's built to standard. Are those standards future-proof? And if not, engage the government.
That's, yeah,
And
very
still,
good point.
if I may, on
Yeah,
the
please.
same topic, because I think it's very important, right? We're constantly investing in infrastructure, and they need to be resilient to disasters. And this is something that we have brought also to the table as UNDRR, to see what can be the reference, therefore the principles in building resilience infrastructure. And what we have seen is that those principles are actually creating a lot of reflections and discussions, not only in countries, in order to be able to see, therefore, what is resilient and what is not, but also with the investors. And the point you're making is actually very pertinent, because it's a matter of being able to have models that are going to be projecting things for the future, but it's also a matter of being flexible enough in terms of adjustments. And I think what is happening in the world at the moment is that we do have part of the world that is constantly creating new environments, building new constructions, and there the use of these principles and, of course, implementation of existing building codes is fundamentally important. And then you have another part of the world that is the old Europe. And I think revisiting these principles will also allow you to start looking at what is your built environment and what you need to do in order to ensure what has happened, at least in Italy, in my country, very painfully, you will see building and bridge collapsing. So it's something extremely tangible, and probably one of the elements that it's a triggering to any investor is that whatever touches upon resilience touches upon our society and the way in which we're going to be shaping our society. Whether it will be sustainable or not is really down to all these choices and how the investors are going to be looking into these dynamics. So there is also a lot of vision that needs to come to the picture in investing.
Absolutely. A lot of choices to be made in, to really get us on that sort of pathway towards resilience. Can I go back to the audience? Great. Yes, please.
Andrew Ross from Global Garden. And it's a question for you, Ujala, if I may.
Yes.
And also for Sophie. We've had no mention so far of biodiversity and natural capital assets as being the fundamental resource on which the entire economy of the world depends. For instance, the floods in Pakistan, with an insured known value of risk of a cyclone coming in one way, met the flood coming down from the deforestation in the Himalayas the other way. And in an instant, the share price of Unilever, Tesco, Marks and Spencer, in fact, the food we ate at lunchtime, and the clothes we're wearing came from Pakistan. How do we put an insurance value on those natural capital assets for resilience?
Thank you. That's a good question and a very valid sort of point to highlight here, that the dependency of our entire society on nature and biodiversity. I'd like to pass to you to answer first, and then I can also add in.
Yeah, I'd jump in, and the lives and livelihoods that those ecosystems sustain. So I think, and I came up a little bit in the previous conversation. So in a former life, as Sean said, I spent a number of years working in the insurance sector. And one of the most challenging things I faced there, talking to investors, talking to underwriters, was there's almost chronic obsession with stuff. What's the asset value, that thing, it's built, that it's tangible, I can see it, someone can go and underwrite it, someone can audit it. And really what I have experienced, certainly in the last 5 years, working much more in the kind of public finance space in the aid sector, is it's obsessed with outcomes and thinking in an outcome-focused way. So don't think of a school as a building, think of it as a mechanism by which we can deliver educational outcomes. You can also deliver education without bricks as well. And that is very difficult to conceive, because it's actually completely anathema to all of the coded finance around the world. Insurance is very similar. In the UK, it's slightly different, but in the US, you buy insurance for your house, you buy insurance for water coming into your house, you buy different insurance for wind blowing the roof off your house. And actually, it's all, again, built around this kind of tangible nature of the built environment. And I think what natural capital is really forcing us, and to Bertrand's point, is taking more of a supplier or value chain approach. And what the aid sector is really pushing for, and what we would want to see, is also, understanding how that affects us in high income economies, how that matters in low income economies, and taking quite a context specific approach to this is actually really challenging. And you all know, 97% of climate finance around the world is tagged to mitigation. I know the numbers are updated. Sorry if my numbers are slightly out of date. 3%, 4% adaptation. That's because we can count carbon. It's a nice little number, not nice number, bad number needs to come down. All of those things. And actually resilience is very difficult to quantify, because what makes me resilient as an individual, living in London, working internationally, is very difficult to what it means for that garment worker working in extremely hot contexts in Pakistan, while also living in an ecosystem which is being dismantled around them, perhaps. So one of the things that we really look at is understanding how that sits in a policy landscape as well. It is not probably news to any of you that many of you probably only buy insurance because someone's made you. Like your national government makes you buy insurance for that car that you drive around, or there's an insurance mechanism that supports you if that train, isn't working, or is a health system that supports you because you might need access to it. And part of that ecosystem is really focusing around resilience. And so I think there's some policy drivers that we need to look at. We need to start counting the value of these ecosystems, quantifying it. Part of it as well, I think, just my last point on this is that because we work in, and I spent a number of years working in private finance and working with the private sector, these things need to derive value for the private sector. And now that's not something we necessarily focus on where I sit, because we're not needing to make returns for shareholders. We need to make returns on resilience and returns on lives and livelihoods. And so the accuracy of that number doesn't need to be so specific for an insured value, to take an example of provision of education. And so I think if we can look more laterally around the services that ecosystems provide us, if we can begin to quantify the risk, not to 3 decimal places, let's just start with a nice round number, we can begin to encode some of these systems into our balance sheets around the world. For me, most of that's around public policy. It's deciding who's going to pay for that risk, and it might not be that national government. It might be really thinking about whose job is it to manage risk, and how do we use public policy to understand that we need to make it somebody's job to manage that risk, manage that ecosystem, and really understand the global nature of these interdependencies as well.
Thanks. Yeah, no, absolutely, Sophie. I think those are all, I agree with everything you just said there. I will add one little point
Please.
on top of that, which is really about our sort of perception and understanding of what resilience is. I think that traditionally resilience has been seen in somewhat of a narrow lens as like infrastructure resilience or your, flood walls and flood defenses. But we have to broaden our understanding of resilience because all of our systems are going to be impacted by climate change, nature, biodiversity, our cities, our communities, our economies. So we have to be able to not look at resilience and risk from a narrow lens, but from more of an outcomes oriented lens, as you said, and to really think about what are the outcomes that we need to achieve in order to have a more resilient as well as prosperous society, and look at the different sort of sectoral and thematic areas where we need to really guide our policies, but also investments to those areas. So nature and capital are a very important part of that. TNFD, yes. So exactly, trying to really help us to direct our attention towards that. So do we have time for one more comment? Sorry, I'm talking to the team, but I think we do. And I see lots of hands up. Alex.
Thank you. Alex Chavarro, I'm an independent climate finance advisor. I've actually been involved with two initiatives recently in relation to resilience. One was the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, spearheaded by the insurance industry and Willis Towers Watson in particular. The other one was the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure report that came out of India earlier this year on the global infrastructure resilience framework. And so that, I think, led to two observations, perhaps one question. The two observations is that it's perhaps useful to look at resilience by distinguishing the resilience of an asset. How do you quantify that? And how do you mitigate against risks that the asset is exposed to versus the resilience that an asset brings to communities? And how do you define that? So my question then is, how do you monetize resilience benefits, both from a private investment point of view, whereby some of these benefits may be intangible, they may also not be directly linked to an asset or not accruing in terms of dollars to an asset? And how do you entice public entities and governments to invest or to ensure that the stakeholders do invest in resilience features that benefit the wider community?
Who would like to take that question on?
Well, I can take the monetization, and as I alluded at the beginning, I think the way we look at it at CDPQ is backwards, saying there's a huge cost if you don't do it, potentially. That wakes people up. When we face investment teams, I say, yeah, there's nothing to worry about. I say to them, can you repeat that in front of the committee? Can you please write it down? And it's like, oh, well, yeah, maybe we need to think about it. And that's the way we approach companies also is, okay, I'm not saying we need to be scaremongering and going overboard, but there is a number of things that we know are unknown certainties, and therefore they need to be taken care of to protect value. Another behavior that we see, especially we are a very long-term investor as a pension plan. So we invest maybe in infrastructure for 20 years. So the team will say, well, we don't have to worry about this because the climate models say that it's not going to happen by 2040. So we'll have sold by then. So who cares? So what you're telling me is that the dot that is not on your radar screen today, but is moving to the radar screen, there is no question whether it is moving or not, it is moving. When we want to sell the investment in 2035, the investors or whoever is going to buy this thing from us will just pretend that climate is not changing. The dot will be on the radar screen, and therefore we will face a loss of value at the time when we sell. And that's how one needs to think, not just say, oh, it's somebody else's problem in the future. It's a problem today.
Absolutely. Does anyone else want to comment on the monetizing of resilience benefits?
I don't know whether I'm commenting or complementing, but one challenge for developing countries is actually to be able to invest in disaster risk reduction. We keep saying that it's definitely less than 1% that they are investing. And yet, from the moment in which they succeed in investing in disaster risk reduction, automatically they are going to be more resilient and therefore more sustainable. So how are you going to be able to address these sort of elements and increase investments? I think developing countries are very often in a catch-22 situation because the accessing of or the issuing of bonding, for instance, is going to be something extremely pricey for them. So how do we support this country through some sort of blending financing so that somehow it becomes cheaper for them to access the funding and therefore to become more resilient? I think this is something that we should really reflect upon, because it would not be something impossible. Again, here we are opening a lot of opportunities. It would not be something impossible to do. And yet it's basically not happening. So that will be a very important channel that I think we need to think, we need to identify solution, because it's going to be a way in which can turn into the famous win-win situation that we are desperately looking for.
Thanks, Paula. I think we have time for one more, and then we'll have to wrap up. So yes, please.
Hi, thank you for the discussion. My name is Saurajit Iyer. I'm from Octus ESG. My question is really about financing resilience through grants or loans, even if concessional. And I'm combining the recent debate with the loss and damage fund with a blended finance project we ourselves did in Zimbabwe to create resilience for women in clean energy business through blended finance structuring. Thankfully, that particular project was selected by the UN Joint SDG Fund, so that problem was solved. But the discussion that came out during that project, and which I see mirroring even in the debate around loss and damage, is the question around using grants, even if recyclable grants. So recyclable grants was a first time concept that I heard during our Zimbabwe project, because conceptually it's the same thing as outcome-based financing. It's just old wine in new bottle. So my question really is that resilience, because when something has got destroyed, the ability to create that cash flow has also got destroyed, whether it's my livelihood or whether it's any small asset, that especially in rural communities. So how do you actually tell that community that, okay, we'll be financing, but it will be a loan that you need to repay, even if only principal, because that person does not have the wherewithal. So there is a financing mechanism, quote unquote, but it's not really workable. But then nobody wants to give a grant in today's, today's world. So how do we solve this? Thank you.
Take that one.
Sure,
Do you
go
want-
ahead, Sophie.
A fantastic example. So we've been following the work of the G7 and the loss and damage discussions. I'm sure you have very closely as well. We have also been part of an agenda on looking at pause clauses, I think is the vernacular. I'm sure many of you are familiar. So if it's a kind of blended finance in a different form, so it's public and private, but how do you allow for these pauses on big pieces of financing, normally concessional financing, be it from a multilateral development bank or World Bank or others, or regional development bank, where the cost of capital then it remains consistent and the loan duration might extend, but it's also allowing communities or countries to respond to the disaster and then delay payments. And I think many of the DFIs we've spoken to are also exploring whether or not those pause clauses would be insurable. So it would be traditional finance alongside with a piece of insurance, so that communities might be able to respond even faster, or there'd be a different budget line. I think they're particularly interesting because it is really a great example, as you were saying, of resilience finance that we need to really nurture and encourage. I think that's set in a wider context of a looming global debt crisis that we're seeing now because of those countries who are most vulnerable, including small island developing states and coastal nations around the world. I think that's a really good question and a great tangible example. And we'll be watching some of the outcomes from COP very closely to see how much action will be taken. I think it's an interesting one. We're not seeing a huge amount of demand for these types of financing packages. Partly because understanding costing the risk is very difficult, and bringing those two communities together has proved quite difficult. Also, whose money, who's paying for what? Is it grant, is it not? And also that's set against the bigger loss and damage discussion, which is actually, this feels a lot like conditions on finance. And I think those discussions need to, will be very heated and need to be very active, especially for those who feel that those communities and countries where the loss and damage fund is supposed to target. So I think there is definitely a seed of an idea, and we've written my colleagues have actually written quite extensively on how that might work from a disaster reduction, but also rapid financing perspective. Certainly for those low-income countries. I think one note of caution when we are looking at, certainly from the pandemic financing, what we are seeing is countries who can ask for those types of solutions often get them. So when I was talking about the 2.7% of crisis financing available, that's pre-agreed before disaster strike, that's disproportionately going to middle-income countries. So we are yet again leaving people behind in those low-income communities. So I would want there to be a pipeline where we are also identifying those projects in low-income countries, not just middle-income countries as well. So there's a very roundabout way of answering your question, which I think we'll be watching COP very closely to see if demand can increase for those sorts of pause clauses or those sorts of different types of blended finance with an outcome focus.
With an outcome focus. And just to add just another point to that, I feel like there are so many different tools in our toolbox. So we have to look at grants, we have to look at bonds, we have to look at loans. There's not one single solution, and all of these solutions are suited to different types of investments as well. So obviously when we have like really high capex requirements and like large infrastructure, we may look to different innovations and instruments, and for smaller projects, look at different pathways to really get that resilience finance to flow. So with that, I think I would like to appreciate everyone's interaction here, your inputs here, bringing your sort of ideas also to the table and asking wonderful questions. I'd like to thank the panelists for your really insightful remarks. And thank you. I think we'll wrap up. And I hope that was useful for you all, and you walk away with, you're inspired for the next steps in sort of really helping to move the needle on resilience finance and the transition to resilience. So thank you.
While the panel is leaving the stage, we've got a quick 5-minute game changer from Matthew McGeoch, Senior Analyst on Transition Plan Monitoring. Transition plan, you're going to hear a lot about. We certify companies' transition plans now. We need to, of course, monitor them. Matthew, you're away.
Thank you very much, Sean. So as Sean has already said, I'm going to be talking about transition plan monitors, but hopefully some of you will be familiar with our state of the market reports. In order to do that, I'm going to use some of our colorful bar charts. But more specifically to do that, so about steering investment towards credible transition plans in particular. Now, as we already know, there are a lot of transition plan standards and guidance out there already. Climate bonds has been on the forefront of this with our standard V4.0 coming out earlier this year, as well as a range of sector-specific criteria to help assess that credibility. And we also can see, though, that companies are beginning to develop transition plans at scale. Within our SLB database, for example, we've seen some 35% of existing SLB issuers have the core tenets of transition plans already ready in their existing disclosure. But where the opportunity then really lies is to leverage those standards to assess transition plans at scale. And so, as Sean already alluded to, I'm going to very quickly talk to you about our transition plan monitor, which we're going to be launching soon, which will track and assess transition plans across entire investment universes on a sector by sector basis. This will be done with the kind of the supporting mechanisms of a transition plan, which are the governance mechanisms, making sure that each company has the structures in place to be able to drive that change forward, as well as the disclosure and the verification for that disclosure to make sure that there is information being communicated transparently, clearly, and verifiably. But then climate bonds' main value add, is going to be then looking at those performance targets, in particular those decarbonization targets, but then also kind of sector-specific secondary targets as well, and looking at those plans to make sure that they have all the assets, activities, and technologies that are 1.5 degree aligned to be able to deliver on those targets. And this is really kind of our bread and butter. We've been looking at green bonds and creating taxonomies and asset-based criteria for more than a decade now, I think, actually. And then this will lead, hopefully at least, to the cherry on top of the cake, implementation. We're also going to be making sure that companies are actually delivering against those targets and tracking their progress through that. Now, to give you a little bit more detail, we're going to start off with phase 1, where we're just going to be looking at steel and cement companies. Apart from the fact that we've got criteria ready for these sectors, and they're very hard to abate sectors as well, we're looking at these companies because it's a relatively small investment universe of companies, so we can make sure that we're getting everything right. But as you can see from the numbers there, in 2023 alone, there's been very low utilization of the sustainable debt markets for these sectors. And we know that this industry has the appetite and the capacity to be able to absorb that debt issuance volume. We know that sustainable debt issuance currently, cumulative issuance stands at 4.3 trillion US dollars, and the entire debt market stands at some 10 times that. So we're really looking forward to helping enable investors to bring these types of issuers to the sustainable debt market, and also to make sure that they're delivering on their credibly ambitious transition plans. In terms of next steps, our goals for this data set is going to be to enable investment decisions and empower those investment engagement or stewardship opportunities to make sure that investors are not only being able to finance these companies that have credible transition plans, but also able to have informed conversations about the strengths and weaknesses of each of those transition plans. On a climate bond point of view as well, we want to make sure that our standards are being used and socialized appropriately as well. And this is a personal one for me, and I'm sure Sean will be chasing me to make sure this one is delivered, is to actually deliver the data set in early 2024 as well, at least phase 1. And then we're going to build this out to a range of other sectors, perhaps energy and real estate to start off with next. But you might ask, Matthew, why are you talking about this now if the data product is not ready to launch? Well, I would like to invite certain types of characters to come join our Transition Plan Monitor working group. We want to make sure that at launch, this is a data set that is operational and useful for investors, asset managers and index providers in particular, but then also that is accurately representing the challenges that issuers face. So we want to be speaking to non-financial corporates, but in particular, those cement and steel issuers at first. But thank you very much, everybody. That's my 5 minutes, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.